Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to do a quick review of industrialization. I've seen a lot of people take this assessment and maybe you got a 6 or 7 out of 10. And I've gone back and looked at the questions that most people have missed. And so I decided to come up with this document to review some of those key things that we're missing a lot of. Okay, so I suggest that as you go through this video with me, you take notes of what's on your screen. You may need to pause the video for a little bit so you can write everything down. But these are going to be this is the condensed information, the key pieces that you will need to know to pass this assessment. Okay, so let's start with the agricultural revolution. I've seen quite a few people have struggled with questions on this, and that's okay. So let's talk about this. The agricultural revolution, you may want to write down the simple definition, was the improvement in farming techniques and machinery. Okay, so that can mean a lot of things. That could be something like the cotton gin. That's a farm piece of equipment, and it improved the production of cotton. We know that that led to more slavery, and of course, a lot of tension before the Civil War. So when I think of the agricultural revolution, I think of anything that makes farming easier. So the cotton gin, maybe a plow that's better, maybe even a tractor eventually. Now the agricultural revolution is going to have both positive and negative effects. So one major positive effect here would be farming was more efficient. All right, that's a really good thing. You can grow more crops, so more crops were produced. That's important. Let me pause. So more crops were produced, but that also means that populations can grow. We talked a little bit about this a very long time ago when we did the early Native Americans focus area. When we talk about the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, how that was a more dependable food source and it helped populations grow, this is kind of like a more advanced version of that. So now we can have even more food because we can plant crops faster because of the tools and machines that make farming easier. Now there's a problem. There's more people around because population's growing, but there's less farm jobs. Because while farming is getting faster and more efficient, machines start to replace farm workers. So you didn't need as many people in the fields if you have a better plow or if you have a tractor. Maybe things aren't being picked by hand. Now we have a machine that's going to do that. So what happens is there's more people, but there's less farm work. So farm workers are unemployed. Maybe you only need 1 or 2 people on the farm instead of 10. What do those 8 people do? So what happens is these farm workers become laborers in the factories. They're forced to leave the farms and move to cities to get factory jobs. So ultimately, the agricultural revolution helps the industrial revolution grow. So it's kind of a cause and then an effect. All right, so here you can see, there's still 2 horses and 2 men working in the fields. They have some sort of plow implement here, but it's likely that this plow maybe replaced a couple men. So now we just need 2 guys out here doing the work with their 2 horses. It makes farming easier, but it takes away jobs. So let's talk about the next revolution. That's the Industrial Revolution. Now, one thing you need to know about the Industrial Revolution is it's a really broad time period. It pretty much goes from like the War of 1812 all the way through World War II. So it's a very long time period. And early industry was very different than industry that would come later in the 1900s. But nonetheless, it's a long period of new inventions and machines. The key part of the Industrial Revolution is now people are working in factories to produce goods instead of working in the fields to produce crops. One good thing about industry was it made goods cheaper and it made tasks easier. So people could afford things more. They didn't have to make their clothes at home. They could now go to a store and buy a dress, or they could order one in a catalog. And it did make some things easier. You could call someone up on the telephone now and have a conversation in real time instead of having to wait a long time for a letter to travel through the mail. So a couple causes of industrialization. First would be the agricultural revolution. That unemployment of farm workers, many of them are going to go work in factories. Factories can hire more people. They can produce more goods. There was also a lot of technical advances in machinery. So, one problem is going to lead to a new solution. So, for example, the cotton gin helps make cotton easier, production of it. More cotton will be shipped north, but then how can factories keep up with that demand of making clothes? Well, the sewing machine will be invented, which then makes sewing clothing easier. But you need people working in the factories to produce those goods. Another cause of industrialization is, at this time, the government really didn't do much with business. The government was very uninvolved in industry. So pretty much that meant factory owners could do whatever they wanted. There was no such thing as a minimum wage or providing health care for your workers. None of that existed. And the government really didn't do a lot to put protections in place for workers. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. You can see here, these are child workers. These are just little boys, probably the age of some of your elementary school siblings. Today, there's laws that say children cannot work, especially long hours in dangerous conditions. But back then, those laws didn't really exist. All right, so effects of industrialization. Well, as workers go to factories to get jobs, it's important that they live close by because people worked really long hours. Oftentimes it would be 12 hours a day, every day of the week. So you couldn't just go back to your farm and ride your horse into town. You actually had to live close to your job. So that's going to lead to the growth of cities. Some other effects of industrialization is there's going to be competition between those unemployed American farm workers and then immigrants that are coming from places like Europe and China to find jobs. So it's bringing lots of groups of people together, unemployed farm workers and immigrants from across the world, but that's going to lead to tension because American workers are nervous and angry that perhaps these immigrants from Europe and China would take their jobs and do the job for less money. So it's a competition issue. But a big thing with the industrialization time period is the U.S. economy shifts from a rural farm economy to an urban industrial economy. When we think about jobs today, most people don't work on a farm. They do other jobs, usually in a city. All right, so just some other key info. Industrialization had been going on for a long time. It does overlap with major U.S. history events. So even though we study these different wars and different events in our own chunks, industrialization is kind of happening in the background the whole time. It's important to know that textile factories was the first major industry. So textile would be anything that's made out of fabric. So the South is going to be producing the cotton quickly, using that slave labor, shipping the cotton into factories in the North, where those northern textile factories would then produce goods such as dresses, hats, any other fabrics. And then finally, industrialization is going to be super important when we talk about the United States and the world as a whole. So we will be talking a little bit about World War I and how industrialization really impacts the world during that war. We saw a little bit of industry during the Civil War, and it's going to be even more important during World War I. And we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, the last thing I'm going to put in this video is urbanization. And I'm going to then pause this because this will be objective 1. Okay, so this is just an objective 1 video. I will make a separate objective 2 video. So urbanization is just a term for cities growing. If a place is urban, it is a city. Okay, so some causes of urbanization kind of ties in with everything we've talked about already. So people are leaving their farms, they're working in factories, they needed to live close by to the factories, so cities start to grow. Apartment complexes will pop up, and eventually cities will grow and grow and grow into the huge cities we know today, like New York. Additionally, you have immigrants that are arriving to the major cities. So if you're coming from Europe, your first stop was probably Ellis Island in New York. But the problem is many of these immigrants were very poor. They did not speak English. They didn't know where to go. And they didn't really have the money to move outside of the city. So many of them just have to stay in the city where they land. So they'll kind of just be hanging out in New York, finding a factory job there, and eventually starting their life. But as more and more people come to those cities, the cities will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the overall effect of urbanization is the U.S. becomes more urban, more city-like, and less rural. So more people will begin living in cities than living on farms. All right, I'm going to pause this here. This is the end of Objective 1. I will be posting a separate video that talks with all the information on Objective 2. Please, like I said, go back, pause the video, make sure you've taken these notes. This is the really key, focused information for your assessments.